all of us, plane crashes are horrible, and all of us recognize why these strike such a chord. Again, we don't know much about who was on that plane and on the helicopter, but we will learn more. And all of us are just heartbroken about it and struggling to deal with the reality that all of us, all three of us, and many of you fly in and out of that airport on a regular basis. Let me say a few things about how I'm thinking about where we are. First of all, there was no one from the military at the briefing. And I think most people who are looking at this and looking at the flight path of both the helicopter and the plane are wondering more about the plane, about the helicopter. What was that mission? Just because it's a training mission doesn't mean the people in the helicopter were trainees who were inexperienced. There are a lot of helicopters since 9/11. If you're in Washington, you know there are a lot of helicopters flying around. The biggest unanswered question right now for me is what was that mission? Why did it have to be done at that time so close to Reagan Airport? Members of Congress are spoiled. They have an airport that's like the Las Vegas airport. It's right in downtown. They can sit at their desk and get to the Reagan Airport. They can leave 25 minutes before their flight because they go right through security. And they fight to get flights direct from Reagan, not from BWI, not from Dulles, back to their state. That flight is a new flight that the Kansas senators helped secure. Reagan Airport has expanded enormously. If you haven't been there lately, you'd be stunned. An airport that close to the nation's capital, a stone's throw away from the White House and Capitol Hill, it's massive. It's the busiest, their busy runways, the busiest runway in the country. So even if it turns out, if the investigation is conclusive, even if it turns out that the cause of this accident was the helicopter, that'll raise questions about why there's so many training missions, in this particular training mission, so near an airport, so near the Capitol. But nonetheless, this should remind people that we need to have this discussion that the senators from Virginia and Maryland have tried the country to have. We can't keep letting every senator and every House member have access to a flight from Reagan back to their state. There's just not enough room. The problem is because we paid to expand the airport, there are a lot of slots there now. So it's harder to stop the proliferation of flights. Last thing I'll say to state two obvious things. One is Sean Duffy's first activity as Secretary of Transportation was to show up and deal with this. And he's getting high marks so far, but this will test Secretary Hegseth. It'll test the new administration all sorts of ways. We'll talk about that. If you've never lived in the area, it's hard to appreciate how close the airport is to downtown and how complicated it can be for all the jurisdictions, federal, state, and local, two different states, DC, all the federal bureaucracies and the military is involved. So the level of coordination here on the investigation is going to be complicated.
Just to echo both of you, your heart breaks to wake up to that news and see that it's been switched to recovery is heartbreaking and tragic. I also worked previously for a member of Congress, I won't say his name, from out west. And for people to kind of understand why do members of Congress push for these flights, a lot of members of Congress, you go back and forth every week. And the member of Congress I worked for would have to go to BWI. It's about 45 minutes away without traffic from Capitol Hill. For those who know the area at rush hour, it can take up to 2 hours. He'd have to fly a connecting flight through Texas. And then once he would land, he'd drive 2.5 hours home because it was a rural area. And if a member can get a direct flight from Reagan, not only is it 10 minutes away, they have special congressional parking. They're allowed to bypass security and they can kind of get on. And so it is a huge deal for your life. If you're going back and forth 48 weeks of the year, to be able to get a direct flight to a much closer airport and kind of just save commute time. And so there is a huge push. And living in DC, like Sean, I was on the other side of the river. The Pentagon, for those who don't know, is half a mile from Reagan. You fly right over. The Potomac's about a 1/4 mile wide. There are 2 military bases over there. Not only do helicopters go out of those bases and go to the Pentagon, the CIA is 2 miles up the river. And after 9/11, you would frequently hear helicopters going up the river to the CIA. And so between the White House, the Pentagon, the CIA, the military bases, there are constantly helicopters moving within less than a mile of that airport. And for those who don't know, after 9/11, they actually talked about moving Andrews Air Force Base, which is about 5 miles east, to Reagan and moving Reagan out to Andrews Air Force Base. And one of the reasons that it got axed is, to Sean's point, there are neighborhoods right around Reagan and military planes are loud, and they did not want military planes roaring over these neighborhoods all night. And it's also one of the reasons they're a little hesitant to expand the runway for more cross-country flights. So your heart breaks. It's a complicated situation in that area. And you just hope they can figure it out and it doesn't happen again.
Since 9/11, things have changed, right? There was a wake-up call for the need to have more assets in place, more procedures in place to evacuate the president and other government officials, members of Congress, to protect the Capitol. So that's the reason why there's been so much increased activity. Sean is right. They're training missions. People say, well, why not do the training missions away from Washington? Some of the training missions must be done there because they're training for actual, dealing with the actual situation in Washington. You'd have to build a replica of the entire city to simulate what they need to do. However, and this will be, I think, a major focus of the early investigation, was this particular mission something specific to that theater, or could it have been done somewhere else? Because a training mission that was optional to be there, it's going to be a lot of scrutiny on that, because whatever the cause, there's just too much air traffic there. I was told that in the chat, someone asked the question of something but Dan and I both alluded to. There are limited slots at every airport in the country, right? And the airlines fight over them. And in normal airport, it's just Delta versus American. Who's going to get the slots? Who can fly where? And they compete for the best routes. They compete in their hubs, etc. DC is different because the members want flights. And as Dan made a great case for it. They're traveling a lot, doing the people's business. But the problem is you can't accommodate everybody. There can't be a direct flight from Reagan back to people's homes. And as Dan alluded to, there are very few flights from Reagan that go west of Denver. There's some, but they're not a lot. And so this buildup of Reagan to allow more members to have direct flights, again, it may have had nothing to do with what caused this crash, but the airspace over DC is too busy because of the expansion of the airport and because of 9/11. You've got civilian and military aircraft just all over the place, and that's not even talking about drones. And so we'll figure out, hopefully, what caused this, but there's just too much of it. And some of it is driven, again, by every member wanting a direct flight home, which is Dan made a good case for.
And Mark, please.
Can
I add to that? The other kind of reality to this, a lot of the FAA Congress has oversight of the FAA, and they have appropriations for airports. Members lean on the airlines with the power of the purse and intimidation to add flights.
Correct. I meant to make that point. That's what happens.
They literally, for people, hopefully I don't get in trouble with Capitol Hill, there is a special members hotline to the airport at DCA, to the air traffic control, to delay flights for when Congress gets out. You can call it, they can bump people, they can get you on flights, they can rebook you. It is a perk of members of Congress. And when the bell rings for the last vote on Thursday night, if you go to the front, technically, the east side of the Capitol, all the cars are lined up with staffers because they all have their special license plate waiting to go to Reagan. They will hold planes for members of Congress.